Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the really profound concepts hidden inside Max and Claude's beautiful novel, The Barista'S Theorem. We're going to explore these invisible threads of patience, readiness, and honestly, the absolutely fascinating ways ordinary people connect with each other. If you've ever just stood at a counter or sat in a busy cafe and suddenly felt the weight of something much bigger passing through the room, well, you're in the exact right place.
Okay, to kick things off, let's look at a striking, totally undeniable number, 312. I really want you to just hold this number in your mind for a second, because it forms the entire foundation of the extraordinary phenomenon we're about to dive into.
So that number, 312, represents the exact number of times a deeply observant barista named Mira physically felt a stranger's defining life moment and chose absolute silence. Think about that. For 11 years, standing right there behind the espresso machine at her café, she felt this intense threshold in her customers 312 times. And every single time, she just let the moment pass, not a single word.
Which naturally brings up a deeply human question for us to ponder as we go through this analysis together. What would you do if you could actually sense that a stranger's life was about to permanently shift? Would you intervene? Would you jump in and offer advice? Or would you recognize, exactly like Mira did, that the really defining decisions of a life are usually made better by silence? Let's start by looking at the invisible architecture of this world and our main subject. Our case study begins in a café called Theorem. It's located in the relentlessly rainy, stubbornly unstructured city of Kilmore. And inside Theorem, Mira acts as this very specific kind of human infrastructure. Her father, who was actually a retired civil engineer, brilliantly described the café with this exact phrase: "It holds the weather." Now, he meant it technically, right? Like the building itself moderates temperature and sound. But Mira realizes this perfectly captures her own role. She is quietly moderating the pressure and the silence of the city for her regulars, a group she affectionately categorizes as the constants. Which brings us to the phenomenon itself. After over a decade of deep, relentless attentiveness to the same people in the exact same room, it builds into this extraordinary, almost physical phenomenon for Mira. She calls it the shift. Now, Mira isn't reading minds here. It's more of an accumulated intuition. The text describes it like a sudden drop in barometric pressure right behind her sternum. It literally alerts her that a person is standing at the very edge of a life-defining decision. But the absolutely crucial key here is that it's entirely content independent. She knows a massive threshold is right there, but she has absolutely no idea what the decision actually is. Now, let's get into our case study, the one big exception. So as we established, for 312 shifts, Mira honored that threshold with total silence, firmly believing that infrastructure just shouldn't announce itself. That is, until a regular named Daniel Avery walks in on a wet November Tuesday. Daniel's a 42-year-old urban planner, and he's been carrying the secret, heavy desire to be a writer for 25 long years. And, like a lot of us, he's basically become a master at putting his dream off with increasingly reasonable excuses. At 17, it was impractical. At 22, well, he was comfortable. By 28, the timing was just way too complicated. At 35, he doubted his talent. And by the time he hit 40, he'd completely convinced himself he was simply too old. But when Daniel walks into the cafe on that Tuesday, Mira feels this overwhelming, completely uncontainable shift radiating off of him. And for the very first time, she breaks her 11-year rule of silence. She literally walks right over to his table and delivers these 7 uncalculated, perfectly timed words. "The thing you keep putting off because the time isn't right, the time is right." Remember, she doesn't know he wants to be a writer. She only knows he is right there at the edge. And the reaction? It's profound. Daniel sits there in stunned silence for precisely 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, if you've ever just sat in a cafe, you know that almost 12 minutes of pure, unbroken silence while staring at a barista is literally an eternity. He doesn't open his book. He just sits there with the sheer weight of an entirely accurate observation made by a stranger who has absolutely no stake in his life. Finally, he thanks her, leaves his cortado half full on the table, and just walks out into the Kilmore rain. This perfectly illustrates the massive gap Daniel had to cross. It's the gap between knowing and deciding. He had known he wanted to write since he was 17 years old. But knowing, that's just internal awareness without action. Mira's stark, agendaless observation completely wiped out his final excuse, the illusion that the right time was some external sign he was waiting for.
She gave him the space to finally resolve that internal pressure into irreversible action, to actually decide.
Let's look a bit closer at the distance to readiness.
You have to ask, why did Mira's single intervention out of 313 thresholds work so flawlessly? Why, Daniel? To answer that, we really have to look at his state of being. The author frames Daniel's 16 years as a city planner as being adjacent. It's a spatial description, right? He wasn't necessarily depressed. He was actually highly competent at his job, but he was living functionally beside a life that wasn't quite his own. He was wearing a face that fit perfectly well, but it wasn't his true face.
By quitting his planning job shortly after that Tuesday and fully dedicating his life to writing, Daniel made a critical leap. He moved from being merely adjacent to life to firmly living inside it. And it wasn't about some sudden euphoric happiness, it was about a profound quality of fit. Over the next decades, he wrote 4 novels, effectively shifting from the margins of his existence right into the absolute center of it. And it beautifully takes 2 full decades for Daniel to finally return to Theorem. I mean, it's such an incredible testament to just letting an experience compost and settle. When he finally crosses paths with Mira again 20 years later, he confirms exactly what her 7 words unlocked that day. He tells her that he is finally inside his life. And for Mira, well, after 20 years, she finally gets to close that circle and learn what the decision actually was.
So what is the ultimate takeaway here? It comes down to the concept of the fulcrum.
What do Mira's decades behind that cafe counter actually represent in the grand scheme of human psychology and connection? The text defines Mira perfectly as a fulcrum. Think about it. A fulcrum doesn't decide the outcome of the weight placed upon it. Mira didn't need to know the specific content of Daniel's decision, or any of the 312 decisions before his. She only needed to provide the stable, attentive, solid ground for their balance to happen. She was the architecture that literally held them while they figured it out themselves. The data-driven emotion of this entire story leaves us with some really profound, actionable truths. It shows us that personal readiness totally eclipses perfect timing. Daniel simply couldn't have made his decision at 17. He needed 25 years of preparation to truly hear those 7 words. It proves that deep attentiveness over time yields a knowledge that rivals sheer intellect. It teaches us that the absolute best infrastructure supports us without ever needing to declare its own importance. And honestly, most beautifully, it reminds us that ordinary lives lived quietly behind a counter or in a corner cafe, hold immense, unquantifiable gravity. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to carry with you today. As you go through your ordinary day, holding the weather for your friends, your family, or even complete strangers, whose invisible architecture are you? Who out there is quietly relying on your stable presence to make their own life-changing balance possible? Really think about that. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.